And good morning, everybody. Nigel, you're right. I want to return to the big picture. I want to tell you about some of the things my organisation, that's the Committee on Climate Change, which is the statutory advisor to the Government and Parliament on carbon budgets. I want to tell you some of the things we are thinking about, that we've reported on in the last couple of weeks, that we will report on in the next couple of weeks, and some of the big debates at the moment. I think it's very timely for anybody working in this area. Somebody just sent me through the front page of The Sun, which you may have heard about, you may have read yourself, where apparently David Cameron said he wants to get rid of all this green crap. And if that was true, if that was the basis for government policy, I think everybody here would be concerned. So I just want to reassure you in what I say that there is still a strong case to act, and actually, if he really does want to get rid of everything, he won't be able to under the Climate Change Act. So let me just talk through a few of these things. And I'm going to touch on climate science, I'm going to touch on international action, what is it we should be doing as a response in this country. I'll say a few things about shale gas, affordability and competitiveness, and if that sounds like a lot to squeeze into 20 minutes, I can see Nigel's really trying to keep this talk on track, to keep this morning on track. I'll stick very much to headlines on each of those. Now, in each of these areas, there is a report on our website if you are interested to go and read the many pages and lots of analysis and details that we have to back up what I will say. So, start with the climate science. Very important in acting to reduce risks of dangerous climate change that you've got a story to tell about the climate science. Now, the IPCC, so that's the body charged by the UN with advising governments on the latest climate science, reported a few weeks ago. And the response to that, if you look at some people, let's say Matt Ridley, who writes a column in The Times, is a famous science writer, you might think, well, based on that report, we don't need to do anything anymore. We can relax. The risks have been overplayed and we can take it easy, maybe do some action, but not now, maybe in a decade, maybe in 2 decades. Now, actually what that report says and what it means for this country, first of all, if we were not to do anything as the world, then if we allow emissions to continue to increase through this century, you would expect temperature increase of 4 degrees, and that is the difference between where we are now and the last ice age. So obviously a very different climate that we would live in, that would leave us exposed to risks of very significant damages for the economy, for people, and for the environment. So we do face risks. And then we've asked in the report we published a couple of weeks ago, well, can we afford to wait as the world 10 years? What if we don't try to peak emissions in 2020? What if we do it in 2030 instead? Could we limit those risks that we face? And the answer is no. We need to act now. We need to peak global emissions in 2020. We need to cut them very significantly thereafter, not just through the 2020s, but for the remainder of this century. So we do need to act now. We do need to act to cut emissions globally, and within that, the UK needs to make its contribution. And the 2050 target in the Climate Change Act is our contribution to limiting risks of dangerous climate change, and it's still an appropriate contribution based on the latest climate science. So that's the story on climate science. Next thing is, well, you hear George Osborne say, we shouldn't be in the UK leading if nobody's following, and obviously that isn't a sustainable position. We cannot tackle climate change on our own in this country. We have to tackle it with other countries together as a global effort to reduce emissions. But while I agree with George Osborne that we shouldn't be leading if nobody's following, well, we're not leading with nobody following. And actually, you've got to question, are we leading anymore? Again, the assessment, when you look at what's happening around the world, there is a very slow UN process. There's a meeting in Warsaw, which I wouldn't expect to move things forward this week, but there is that UN process. On the ground, there are many countries, major economies, that have now made ambitious and comparable commitments to the UK to reduce emissions over the next 10 years. So we are not acting alone. That's a very clear message based on the evidence. Other countries, China is leading, I think, the low-carbon revolution now in the world, making much bigger investments than the UK. Obviously, it's a bigger economy, but when you adjust that for per capita, for example, the level of investments in China is still very high. Even the United States is now acting and has a very good story to tell about making significant emissions cuts since 2005 and over the next 10 years. So we are not acting alone. We're not leading with nobody following. We are there with other countries together driving emissions down. That's the second really important thing. Now, our carbon budgets are the UK contribution to global emissions reductions that's required over the next decade and 2 decades. And we're committed in legislation to reduce our emissions by 50% in 2025 on 1990 levels. That's through something called the fourth carbon budget. Now, if that sounds like a lot, 50%, well, we've already cut emissions by 25 to 30%, so we are a lot of the way there already to this 50% cut, which we are committed to in legislation. And the way that we can achieve that budget is through energy efficiency improvement, which I'm sure a lot of you are involved in here on a practical basis. It's through fuel efficiency improvement in cars. It's through investment in a portfolio of low-carbon technologies for power generation, renewables. We've heard about wave this morning. It's wave, it's other renewable technologies. It's carbon capture and storage, and it's nuclear. It's the use of sustainable bioenergy. It's the starting to, as we get further out in time, electrify both heat and surface transport. If we can do all of those things over the next couple of decades, then we can achieve that 50% cut, which is an economically sensible thing to do, by the way. That 50% cut was the cost-effective way of achieving our longer-term objectives. And if you delay relative to that, all you do is store up very significant costs and risks for the future. So that is how we can achieve what is an economically sensible target. That target was set back in 2011, and since then, shale gas has really come onto the agenda in this country. And I think the story as well, politicians are very tempted to say, look what's happened in the States. They've had this shale gas revolution. Prices of gas have plummeted. That's great for affordability of energy, and it's great for growth because there's been an industrial revolution around the investment and location of energy-intensive industries in the US. And we'd like to have that here. And while we might like to have it here, we might not, by the way, on a carbon basis, but while we might, actually, you cannot transplant that story to the UK and to Europe. So the story on shale gas is, first of all, on a carbon footprint basis. It's sometimes said that this has a carbon footprint the same as coal. There are ways of making sure that it has a similar carbon footprint to other forms of gas. So that's the first thing. If we're going to use gas in the UK, and if we get shale gas out of the ground in a responsible way, using the best practice for what's called fugitive emissions, then from a carbon perspective, it's as good as using natural gas and probably better than importing LNG from other countries. As I say, there will be ongoing gas demand. So even if we're successful with energy efficiency improvement, even if we're successful with renewable heat in our buildings and in our industries, there will still be a very significant demand for gas in this country over the next decade, 2 decades, and even 3 decades. And it's only as you get into the 2030s and 40s that you would expect to see that gas demand really fall away. So there's a nice match-up between shale gas and ongoing gas demand in this country. And if we can use the shale gas to meet that demand, well, there are benefits in terms of sovereignty. So we can have a domestic source of gas rather than importing LNG, for example, from countries where there is possibly geopolitical risk. We can have jobs in areas where there may be unemployment problems at the moment. So there's a local economy story. There'll be profits for companies like Quadrilla, which is not great for everybody, but it's good if you can take some of those profits back in corporate taxes. That's all the benefits of shale gas. Well, let's be very clear. Nobody's expecting that shale gas will change the price of gas in the European market or in the UK. So there is not enough shale gas that will be around in the European market to have a significant impact on the gas price. So it's not the solution to the affordability problems in this country, and it isn't the basis for an industrial revolution with energy-intensive industries that aren't here at the moment. So petrochemicals, for example, investing at scale because of low gas prices. That isn't going to happen in this country. So shale gas is not a game changer in terms of the gas price. It's not a game changer in terms of what we should be doing in terms of investing in a portfolio of low-carbon technologies for power generation in particular. There's been a big debate within the coalition. Because of shale gas, shall we abandon our low-carbon policies for the electricity sector? And shall we have a dash for gas like we did in the 1990s? That would not make economic sense, and it would not be compatible with meeting our carbon budgets and targets under the Climate Change Act. So if we move on from shale gas to affordability, I've said that isn't the solution to the affordability problem. It's very important in these highly charged political debates to understand what the facts are relative to the often exaggerated claims about the impact of low-carbon policies on energy bills. Now, we all know, because we consume energy and we pay our energy bill, everybody in this room will have seen their bill go up very significantly over the last few years. So if you look back to 2005, you look at the bill, even before the rises this winter, you can see bills have gone up by about £500 for the typical dual-fuel household. Now, within that, you ask, well, what is the impact of low-carbon policies. And you've got to split that into, well, the support for renewable power generation, and that accounts for about £30 out of the 500. And then the support for energy efficiency improvement, for example, through the supplier obligation. It used to be called CERT, now it's called the Energy Company Obligation, and that accounts for about £45 of that £500 increase. So the low-carbon policies, the renewables, £30, whether you call the supplier obligation a low-carbon policy or a social policy, that's £45. The total is £75, so it's not been the main driver up to now of the energy bill increases that are £500. That's for other reasons, whatever they might be. A lot of it is to do with the change in the price of gas in the international market. If you look at what's happening and what's kicked off all of these debates at the moment, the political debates, it was partly that Ed Miliband raised the stakes with his promised price freeze. It's the response of David Cameron saying, well, we'll get rid of the green aspect of energy bills at the moment. But it's the big and significant energy bill increases that have been announced by the big six energy companies recently, and those range from £100 to £150 for a typical household. And the first thing they say, each of those companies, is, well, we've put bills up because of green policies, and then there's a couple of other things. But the thing that's resonated in the media and gone through the political debates is it's the green policies. And I think people think, well, that £100, £150 is down to green policies. And again, actually, within that support for low-carbon power generation is responsible for about £10 out of the 100. And you can debate and discuss, but there isn't any evidence that there's any increase needed to support the energy efficiency policy, so the energy company obligation. That leaves you saying, well, it's £10 out of £100 to £150 over the next year or so. Obviously, £10 is not accounting for the majority of £100. So if you look at the facts on this rather than the claims, there's a slightly different take that you would end up with. Now, we've got to be clear that our low-carbon policies will add money to people's energy bills over the next years, and I think the government is a little bit weak here. They claim that, well, on the one hand, policies put bills up, and on the other, energy efficiency will bring them down. It all cancels out, and we shouldn't worry at all because there'll be no impact on bills, and that's not what people see. They see bills going up. They hear that it's because of green policies, and actually energy efficiency improvement on the residential level, we're not doing very well through the Green Deal, for example, at the moment. And so we're very clear, well, support for low-carbon power generation is sensible. It will put bills up. It will put bills up by about £10 each year for the next 6 or 7 years, so that in 2020, energy bills will be £100 higher than they are now for the typical household in order to support investment in low-carbon power generation. That's a sensible thing to do, but it does have a cost, lead you to a benefit in the future when we would have lower prices as you get into the 2020s and the 2030s. Maybe we can offset that through energy efficiency improvement, but if we can't, it's £100 increase, it's not hundreds, and it's not thousands, and the biggest number I've seen for the 2020 impact is £3,000. It's £100. Beyond that, you wouldn't expect to see significant energy bill increases because of low-carbon policies. We think in 2030 you might need an extra 20 quid for the typical household, but it's a very small number. So you pay that money to 2020, you take that pain, and then there isn't much more to do to carry on that low-carbon path, but it gives you that longer-term benefit. So that's the affordability story that is obviously in the middle of all of the political debates at the moment. Another story is competitiveness, and again, let's see what George Osborne says. He says, I don't want to close down an aluminium factory in this country because of our low-carbon policies. And again, he's right. Nobody wants to close down factories in this country because of low-carbon policies. That would be a silly thing to do. And it's very clear from the evidence that there isn't any aluminium or any other factory that has closed down in this country because of low-carbon policies. And that's not surprising because low-carbon policies haven't really begun to bite in the industrial sector yet. So the costs associated with those policies are very small. But if you look forward and you worry about not closing down the whole economy, you worry about energy-intensive industries where energy costs really impact the bottom line of those companies. And you look at the energy-intensive industries, well, they're protected under the European Emissions Trading Scheme, and actually they do very well out of that in terms of getting free allowances. So if anything, they can make a benefit from that scheme. It doesn't cost them anything, and maybe they can make some money there. So you don't worry too much about those companies. You do worry about electricity-intensive industries like iron and steel in this country. But again, the government is onto that. We've recommended to the government that those industries should be helped and supported. The government has responded, and those industries are helped and supported to the point that you would not expect any competitiveness impacts, any leakage to happen because of low-carbon policies in future. Hasn't happened in the past. You would not expect it to happen in the future. So for anybody who says, I'm worried about competitiveness, we all should be, we all are, but actually we have policies and approaches that are in place already that will stop those competitiveness risks ever crystallising. Let me finish by saying, well, we've got this forthcoming budget. I've said it commits us to a 50% emissions cut on 1990 levels. And it's the anchor for all of our low-carbon policies at the moment, whether you're talking about the energy efficiency policies or the support for low-carbon power generation or the bioenergy policies, all related to that fourth carbon budget. And you may know that when it was set in 2011, there was an agreement it would be reviewed in 2014, in particular with respect to what is the EU doing and are we out of step with the EU. And actually the Climate Change Act says we can't be out of step with the EU because part of the budget has to reflect whatever is agreed at the European level. So there's a safeguard built into that. But again, if you look at our report that we published a couple of weeks ago, you ask the question, are we out of step with the EU? I mean, all you can say is, well, the EU hasn't agreed where it's going to 2030, but the evidence available, their analysis, what's being negotiated, our fourth carbon budget is at the low end of the range of ambition currently being discussed in Europe. So depending on how that process plays out over the next months, over the next several years actually, is what it will take probably to get a European agreement, then if anything you would expect we will be tightening our budget, so increasing the ambition that's in it, not loosening the budget as some people possibly have hoped in the political space and particularly in the Treasury. I think there's a desire to loosen our budget. If anything, you will tighten it over the next years and increase the ambition, not the opposite. So I can see I've got 3 minutes left, so I've skated through all those issues. It has been a very high level, but let me summarise and say all of these elements that have led us to where we are in terms of the case for action and making that commitment in this country stay strong. The climate science is robust and it tells us we face significant risks. Our carbon budgets are an appropriate contribution to a global response to that risk. We're not acting alone. Other countries are acting now. They're acting with us. We're not leading with nobody following. We are part of a collective response to acting on the risks of climate change. There's a set of things that we know we can do in this country that are cost-effective, that are feasible over the next 5, 10 and 15 years to meet the carbon budgets which we have committed to in legislation. So that's the fourth carbon budget. Shale gas is not a game changer. It may have benefits, but those are probably in terms of energy sovereignty to meet ongoing gas demand, jobs, and corporate taxes on profits. They are unlikely to be, in terms of the price impact on gas, that it's unlikely to have any impact on the affordability issues in this country, and it cannot be the basis for a new industrial revolution based on the use of cheap gas in energy-intensive industries. Affordability, let's be clear what the facts are. It is not low-carbon policies that are driving the very significant increases we've seen in bills. There will be increases in the future, but they are small, they are manageable. If you look at competitiveness, don't believe anybody who says we are driving industry and investment abroad, because there is no evidence to say that's happened in the past, and it is unlikely to happen in the future because of the policies that we've got in place. And although we are reviewing the fourth carbon budget, and you'll see this play out in the new year, there may be a politically quite highly charged debate based on very different ideological positions that there are in the government. But if you look at the evidence and the facts and the legal aspects, well, that budget, if anything, will be tightened, and it's unlikely that you could ever make a legal case to loosen it. So I hope, if I were to talk to you in a year's time, we will say we've still got the fourth carbon budget. We're making progress on doing all of these things which are very sensible, and my organisation will be continuing to work to hold the feet of the government to the fire to make sure that happens. Thank you.